Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt, when you're praying, like you're talking to a brick wall? Like God just wasn't listening to you, or worse, like he had maybe even abandoned you? Have you ever felt even that maybe he had turned against you and was somehow working against you? Like, have you ever gone through something so painful, so confusing, that it didn't just make you question your circumstances, but it made you wonder where God was in it all, and if he was even there at all? Well, if so, this morning's passage in Lamentations is for you. This morning, we are jumping back into our series through Lamentations, where we're learning to hold on to hope, resurrection hope, in a broken and ruined world, bringing our pain and our hard questions, our lament, honestly, before God in prayer. And 2 weeks ago, as we looked at Lamentations 1, we were introduced to the unimaginable grief and devastation of Jerusalem after its destruction by Babylon in the exile of God's people in 587 BC, an event recorded at the very end of Jeremiah, the most catastrophic event that the Israelite people, the Jewish people, went through in the entire Old Testament. And we saw, as we looked at that chapter, as we looked at that poem, that the poet, he doesn't rush past the pain with simple answers or thin cliches like we often do, but he takes his time to slowly and carefully and methodically name the ruin, line by line and image by image. That's Lamentations 1 in a nutshell, as we too learn to name our ruin, the ruin of our lives and the ruin of our world, learning to lament those things honestly before God in prayer. Today then, as we come to chapter 2, the focus of this poem shifts a little bit as we move from naming the ruin, as we did in chapter 1, and bringing our pain to God, to now wrestling with God's role in the suffering, bringing our questions about God now to God. That's what Lamentations 2 does for us, with some of the big questions that this chapter, this poem asks, being questions like this. What do you do when it feels like God himself is somehow behind the pain in your life? And how do you respond when God feels distant from you? And what do you do when God doesn't just feel distant from you, but it feels like he's actually the one that you're struggling against? What do you do in these moments? These are some of the questions that are behind the words of Lamentations 2, the chapter that for many is considered to be one of the darkest chapters of the whole book, of all 5 chapters in Lamentations. Not just because of the suffering described in it, but because of how it speaks so directly to God's role within that suffering, and the questions that it then raises for the poet and for us as well, as we consider our own pain and suffering and God's role within it. So, heavy book, heavy chapter. Are you ready? Buckle up. If you brought your Bibles or your Bible apps, I want to invite you to open them with me now to Lamentations chapter 2, where, like chapter 1, is another acrostic poem. 4 of the 5 poems in the entire book of Lamentations are acrostic, with the poet structuring his book in a way, he's using the Hebrew alphabet to demonstrate his pain. It's a way of him saying, here's all of our pain from A to Z. It's a poetic, kind of artistic way for him to express his pain prayerfully and poetically before God. He does this again in chapter 2, another acrostic poem. And this morning, I'm going to do the same thing that I did with Lamentations 1, and I'm just going to read the entire poem for you, letting Lamentations speak to us in its own voice, stopping here and there with a few comments along the way just to help us understand what it is that we're reading. And then after that, I'll provide a couple observations from the text as we consider what this poem, this ancient poem, might mean for us here today. So, Lamentations 2. There's 22 verses, 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It's an acrostic poem. Here's what it says, starting with verse 1. The Lord, in his anger, has cast a dark shadow over beautiful Jerusalem, with the first word here in this poem in Hebrew being the exact same first word as in chapter 1. It's the Hebrew title of the book, the word echla, which means how. How. Again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, how Lamentations, this Hebrew, is called how. There's a book of the Bible called how. Like, how, God, could you let this happen? How could God in his anger have turned on this city in such a vengeful way? That's what the poet is saying right here in verse 1. Reading on. The fairest of Israel's cities lies in the dust, thrown down from the heights of heaven. In his day of great anger, the Lord has shown no mercy even to his temple. Without mercy, the Lord has destroyed every home in Israel. In his anger, he has broken down the fortress walls of beautiful Jerusalem. He has brought them to the ground, dishonoring the kingdom and its rulers. Now, right away, we need to notice something. The poet here, he's not blaming Babylon for the destruction, but he's saying very clearly here that this was the Lord's doing, that God did this. And it's really important to understand that this is covenant language. I talked about this a couple weeks ago. This is covenant language and the outworking of everything God had warned would happen if his people turned against him, which I'll say more about a little bit later. Verse 3 now. All the strength of Israel vanishes beneath his fierce anger. The Lord has withdrawn his protection as the enemy attacks. He consumes the whole land of Israel like a raging fire. He bends against his bow against his people as though they were his enemy. His strength is used against them to kill their finest youth. His fury is poured out like fire on beautiful Jerusalem. Yes, the Lord has vanquished Israel like an enemy. He has destroyed her palaces and demolished her fortresses. He has brought unending sorrow and tears upon beautiful Jerusalem. As shockingly, the poet describes God like an enemy here, doesn't he? He bends his bow, he says. He pours out his fury. He vanquishes Israel like an enemy. It's strong language, uncomfortable language, unsettling language, and it's supposed to be that way. That's the intention here of the poet, as this is how God's judgment could feel. It was confusing and perplexing for Jerusalem, just as much, well, far more, obviously, than it is for us to read these words. Verse 6. He has broken down his temple as though it were merely a garden shelter. The Lord has blotted out all memory of the holy festivals and Sabbath days. Kings and priests fall together before his fierce anger. Verse 7. The Lord has rejected his own altar. He despises his own sanctuary. He has given Jerusalem's palaces to her enemies. They shout in the Lord's temple as though it were a day of celebration. As the poet here describes the destruction of the temple, God's own dwelling place, the holiest building in all of Jerusalem, as it was desecrated and completely destroyed by the Babylonians, with everything that once centered their worship and their identity now being gone and destroyed. Verse 8 now. The Lord was determined to destroy the walls of beautiful Jerusalem. He made careful plans for their destruction, then did what he had planned. Therefore, the ramparts and the walls have fallen down before him. Notice again the language here, right? God planned this, and God carried this out. Meaning this is not random chaos or suffering like you and I might experience here today, but this is actually a fulfillment of all that God said would happen if his people rebelled against him. This is his judgment. It's hard, it's heavy, but it's true. Verse 9, Jerusalem's gates have sunk into the ground. He has smashed their locks and bars. Her kings and princes have been exiled to distant lands. Her law has ceased to exist. Her prophets receive no more visions from the Lord. Verse 10. The leaders of beautiful Jerusalem sit on the ground in silence. They are clothed in burlap and throw dust on their heads. The young women of Jerusalem hang their heads in shame. I have cried until the tears no longer come. My heart is broken. My spirit is poured out in agony as I see the desperate plight of my people. Little children and tiny babies are fainting and dying in the streets, showing us the very real human cost as the devastation here touches everything and everyone, from the leaders in Jerusalem all the way down to the children in the streets. It's the devastation is not just abstract. It's not just a feeling that they had, but it was real and all-encompassing, impacting the most vulnerable people amongst them, the children. Verse 12, they cry out, the children do, to their mothers, "We need food and drink." Their lives ebb away in the streets like the life of a warrior wounded in battle. They gasp for life as they collapse in their mother's arms. "What can I say about you? Who has ever seen such sorrow? O daughter of Jerusalem, to what can I compare your anguish? O virgin daughter of Zion, how can I comfort you? For your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you? Your prophets have said so many foolish things, false to the core. They did not save you from exile by pointing out your sins. Instead, they painted false pictures, filling you with false hope." As the poet here points to the prophets back to the days of Jeremiah, where many of them minimized the warnings God was giving through them instead of calling them back to the Lord. They said, it's not a big deal. God's not going to do this. God's not going to act this way. It's not going to be as bad as what Jeremiah is saying. Peace, peace. But there was no peace. They ignored the seriousness of sin, minimized it. And now Jeremiah is calling them out for it. Verse 15, all who pass by jeer at you. They scoff and insult beautiful Jerusalem, saying, "Is this the city called most beautiful in all the world and joy of all the earth?" All your enemies mock you. They scoff and snarl and say, "We have destroyed her at last. We have long waited for this day, and it is finally here." Verse 17. But it is the Lord who did just as he planned. There's that language again. He planned this. He has fulfilled the promises of disaster he made long ago. He destroyed Jerusalem without mercy. He has caused her enemies to gloat over her and has given them power over her. The Lord has done what he planned, the poet says. Again, this is covenant language, not to be applied to us today. This is covenant language with God being faithful to his word, to his promise, to his covenant that he had made with Israel, fulfilling the covenant consequences of broken covenant, being true to what he said. Verse 18, cry aloud before the Lord, O walls of beautiful Jerusalem. Let your tears flow like a river day and night. Give yourselves no rest. Give your eyes no relief. Rise during the night and cry out. Pour out your hearts like water to the Lord. Lift up your hands to him in prayer, pleading for your children, for in every street they are faint with hunger. As even after all this complaining, the poet says, keep calling out to God. Keep praying. Don't give up. Cry out for your children. He's inviting his people to be steadfast in prayer, even in the suffering, even in the confusion around God's role in their suffering. Verse 20 now. Oh Lord, think about this. Should you treat your own people this way? Should mothers eat their own children, those who once bounced on their knees? Yikes. Should priests and prophets be killed within the Lord's temple? Verse 21. See them lying in the streets, young and old, boys and girls, killed by the swords of the enemy. You have killed them in your anger, slaughtering them without mercy. You have invited terrors from all around, as though you were calling them to a day of feasting. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one has escaped or survived. The enemy has killed all the children whom I carried and raised. That's Lamentations 2. The darkest chapter in the whole book, and one of the darkest chapters in the entire Old Testament. As once again, just like with chapter 1, the poet does not offer even one clear glimpse of hope. He provides no comfort, no resolution, no Jesus, no bow on top of it all, nothing. Just 22 verses of sorrow and grief and honest complaint. This time wrestling with the reality that God somehow in his anger and judgment has brought this about. Even going so far, the poet does, to ask God, if maybe God, did you go too far here? Like, I understand that you're just, that you're holy, that we're in this covenant relationship with you, but please, like, where's your mercy here? This is too much. You've gone too far. Which is what makes this chapter, this poem, this funeral dirge, really, so difficult. As it forces us to wrestle with a question that we would rather avoid, right? The question being, what do we do when God just doesn't feel distant from us, but like it does here in Lamentations 2, it seems to be that he's actually somehow the one behind our suffering. What do we do then? And how does all this work for us here today? Well, to help us grapple with this, I want to unpack a couple observations from this text. I have two observations that I hope will help shed some light on these sorts of questions, with the first observation then being this. It's around God's role in the suffering. I talked a little bit about this as we read through the chapter together, as again and again throughout the chapter, 12 times actually, the poet directly declares that God is the one acting in Jerusalem's pain. That, for example, he cast down the city in verse 1, and he withdrew his protection in verse 3, and he tears down the temple in verses 6 and 7, with the poet flat out saying in verse 17, kind of the peak of this poem, that the Lord has done what he has planned. As throughout the chapter, we find action word after action word, with God himself being the subject of almost every one of them. As it's clear that the poet at least believes that God himself is the one doing the destroying through Babylon. Which I know, as I say that, might feel a bit unsettling for us here today. Confusing even for some of us to think that God would do such a thing. That's hard to wrap your head around. We talked a bit about this when we worked through Lamentations 1 a couple weeks ago, but I want to be very clear about this again here today, because I know how easy it can be to take a passage like this and then to apply it directly to our own lives, assuming that this is what happens in our lives as well. What happened in Lamentations is what happens in our life as well. When bad things happen to me or to our world, it's because it's God punishing us or God's punishing me for my sin. This is all God's judgment. Some people draw straight lines between passages like this and our own stories here today, but we need to be very careful here to avoid doing that. Because what's happening here in Lamentations is not something that we can apply universally. In fact, Lamentations 2, it's not about us at all, but it's about ancient Israel, who God was in covenant relationship with, having clearly laid out in places like Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 and elsewhere exactly what would happen if they turned from him. Namely, blessing for obedience, and number 2, very real consequences for disobedience. Blessings for obedience, very real consequences for disobedience. Break this covenant and there will be judgment. And then over generations, as Israel did disobey, as they did rebel, worshiping other gods instead of the one true living God, treating the poor in ways that dishonored God, amongst other things. God, in his patience, what did he do? He sent prophets, godly prophets, like Jeremiah, to call them back to himself, and to warn them and to plead with them that if they didn't stop, if they didn't turn from their idol worship, if they didn't stop in their mistreatment of the poor, that there would be punishment for them. In his patience and kindness, he sent prophet after prophet after prophet to warn them and to call them back for centuries. And yet they refused to listen. They refused to obey, leading first to the exile of the northern kingdom in Assyria and now to Judah's exile in Babylon. Meaning then that what we're seeing here in Lamentations is not random or arbitrary, but it is the result of long-standing warnings. With God telling them, like, if you keep living this way, things are going to go badly for you. There's going to be judgment and destruction. One way to think of it would be like this. Think of a doctor warning his patient for years. If you don't change, this is going to catch up to you. Like, I know you like cheeseburgers, but I'm telling you, your arteries are clogged. You got to stop with the cheeseburgers. If you don't, there's going to be judgment. Your body's going to explode. And you ignore the doctor's warning. You go year after year for your physical, and he keeps telling you, it's getting worse, it's getting worse. I'm telling you, things aren't going to go well for you if you keep down this path. And then one day, tragedy occurs, and people are left going, why? Well, it might have had something to do with the cheeseburgers. I'm just saying, right? It might have had something to do. That's kind of what's happening here with Israel, in a way. With God not only being the one who warned them through the prophets, but also in this case, he's the one who acted, as God had told them repeatedly what would happen if they didn't listen. And in their stubborn headedness, they did not listen. It's what we see here in Lamentations. It's the outworking of God's holy justice, his covenant judgment after generations of warning as he works through the Babylonians to bring about destruction as an expression of his righteous anger and his wrath against Jerusalem. Which, if nothing less, should at least make us step back and go, whoa, God takes sin very seriously. Like, sin's a big deal. We serve a holy and righteous God who does not put up with sin. Not because he's harsh, not because he's not kind, not because he's not patient, but because he's holy and he is just. And he will always do something about sin, as he did here. Which, by the way, when we read about God's anger and wrath, as we do at least 8 times here in this chapter in Lamentations 2, we need, I think, to be very careful not to import our human understanding to those words, anger and wrath. Because while human anger, at least my anger, is often reactive, right? It's impulsive and out of control, say things I don't really mean or say them too harshly. It's an emotional response, right? Our anger often is an emotional response to things not going our way or when we are hurt or threatened or feel wronged, right? That's our anger. That's human anger. But God's anger is not like that. Like, this is not God flying off the handle in rage because his people broke the rules. Instead, this is God's justice and righteousness in action. And it's measured and purposeful and patient, and ultimately it's aimed at restoration. He wants to see his people come back to him. His anger is not like ours. It is a righteous anger, a righteous anger. It's been said that God's anger is his love burning white hot. His anger is his love burning white hot. Not because anger is love, but because it flows from his deep commitment to what is good and right and true and beautiful. We're like a parent whose kid has cancer will hate cancer. So God hates sin, right? Because he sees what it's doing to the kids that he loves. He hates sin just like a parent hates cancer, and he gets angry at what sin is doing to his kids. That's God's anger. Where it can get tricky, though, for us in understanding this is when God's kids aren't just affected by the disease of sin, if you will, but it's actually coming from within them, right? When God's anger seems to be focused directly and specifically on them as his people, not just the sin, as we see here in Lamentations. Like, how are we to make sense of God's anger then? It's hard. It's hard. But one of the ways the New Testament talks about this idea of God and his righteous anger, allowing people to experience the consequence of their sin, Oh, sorry, let me say that again. I read that wrong. Right? One of the ways that the New Testament talks about this is around the idea of God in his righteous anger allowing people to experience the consequence of their sin. Where in Romans 1, for example, the Apostle Paul, in talking about God's wrath there 3 times, he says that God gave them over to their sin. Meaning then that part of God's wrath is simply giving people what they want and just handing them over to the consequences of what they want, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's God's wrath. You want to go in that direction? I'm not going to stand in your way. You want this thing? You can have that thing. I'm not going to stand in your way, but you're going to have to deal with the consequences of all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think that's a picture of God's wrath, his anger. It's a handing us over to our sin, to the consequences of our sin. Not because he doesn't care, but as an expression of his love and justice, where just as we, as those of us in the room who are parents, need sometimes to let our kids learn the hard way. Any of you parents in the room have a kid who needs to learn the hard way? I was that kid. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. Oh, you sure? Oh, yeah, it was hot. Why did you let me touch that? I told you not to touch that. Sometimes we got to let our kids learn the hard way. And that's how God deals with us sometimes. He allows us to experience the consequences of our actions. In many ways, that's what we're seeing here in Lamentations 2. As God, after generations of warning, hands his people over to the consequences of broken covenant that he had warned them about 1,000 times over. He's just given them over to the consequences of their rebellion, which in this case was God's active judgment against them through Babylon. As God stayed true to his word, allowing his people to experience the consequence of covenant unfaithfulness. Which certainly doesn't make any of this easy to understand or to come to terms with. This should be jarring. This should be hard for us to reconcile in our heads and hearts. But I hope it does help us see the unique nature of this covenant relationship that God had with his people, and that none of this was random. Unlike so much of the pain and suffering that we experience here today, where it's not God punishing us. It's just the reality of our broken, sinful world. And that now leads us to the second observation from this chapter, and it's around God's absence. God's absence. And when prayer goes unanswered. Because in Lamentations 2, it's not just that the people are suffering, it's that in the middle of their suffering, God is silent. Like, notice what's missing in this chapter. In verse 9, we're told that Jerusalem's law ceased to exist and that her prophets received no more visions from the Lord. What's this mean? Well, it means, quite simply, that God is not speaking to them, that he's gone quiet on them. And yet, despite that, as the chapter moves forward, what do we see? We see the people continuing to pray despite God's silence. In verse 18, crying out before the Lord. In verse 19, lifting their hands in prayer, even confronting God, basically, near the end of the chapter in verse 20, saying, should you treat your own people like this? Like, do you hear the anger even in a question like that? There's a little bit of anger, it's a little edgy, like, God, what are you doing here? Where's your mercy? Should you be doing this? You've gone too far. As the poet brings his raw and desperate and even angry questions before God in prayer, even as God doesn't respond. As to the prophet and to the people of Jerusalem, it felt, no doubt, like their prayers were falling on deaf ears, just as we sometimes feel today, right? Like they're praying to a brick wall. But it's not just God's silence that we see here in this chapter either, is it? As 6 to 8 times, the poet actually describes God as being opposed to them, saying in verses 4 and 5, for example, that he bends his bow against his people, and the Lord has vanquished Israel like an enemy. Which means that God doesn't just feel far away from them or silent or absent. That would be better, actually. Because the poet's saying it feels actually like he's against us. He's working against us. He's hunting us down. He's trying to kill us. Which means then that the suffering being described here in Lamentations 2 it's not just physical suffering, as intense as that was, but it's spiritual suffering as well. As God feels distant and opposed to them even, with their prayers going unanswered, or so it may have seemed. Do you see the irony here as well? God is doing this to them, and yet they keep coming to God to ask him for deliverance, as the one who was judging them would also be the one who would deliver them. It's hard to make sense of chapters like this, but it's in God's word for a reason. It shows us the rawness and realness and discomfort sometimes of faith. And if we're honest, this is where it hits close to home for a lot of us, doesn't it? As we talk about spiritual suffering, because for many of us, the hardest part of suffering, it isn't just the suffering itself. It's when God feels absent to us in it. Like, it's one thing to walk through pain, but it's another thing to walk through pain and feel like you're doing it alone, without God. Like when God feels near, when you're hearing his voice and you have this tangible sense of his presence in your life, you experience his comfort, his peace, his guidance, all of this, you can actually endure a lot in those moments when you feel close to God. This was actually my experience when I was first diagnosed with pancreatic cancer back in September. As in those early days, God's presence and his nearness, it carried me through. I was like, I think, as weird as it feels, like I think I can get through this with God's help. Like I feel this inner strength that I just can't explain, as God was so close and near to me in those moments. But when he feels far away, when he feels silent and absent, and even maybe in our confusion and disorientation of what's going on in our lives, we can even feel like he's somehow working against us. Well, that's where things can get really disorienting. And that's when questions and anger even can start to bubble to the surface. It's one thing to walk through pain, but it's another thing to walk through pain while feeling like God has gone missing in the pain. Which truthfully was kind of how I felt at times during my recovery from surgery during the winter, for whatever reason. As at times I felt like I was praying to a brick wall, like God was just distant. Sometimes I still feel that way for whatever reason. It can be a little disorienting, especially as suffering goes on, as it persists. You know, in the early days, God's near, and then as it goes on, it's like, man, this is getting really hard. Like, where are you in this, God? But that's the space that Lamentations 2 is living in. This space of feeling disoriented and disappointed in, and even to some degree, angry at God, as God felt absent in the poet's pain. And worse, it felt, to the poet at least, as if God was working against them. Even as, in the midst of all that, the poet, people of Jerusalem, continued to pray faithfully in the midst of it all. That's the second of two observations from the text in Lamentations 2, with the first one being around God's role in the suffering. So we talked about that, along with God's anger and wrath. And as we wrestled, secondly, with God's absence in the pain, and even his opposition to Jerusalem in this particular story. So what does this mean for all of us? That's the question, right? What do we do with Lamentations 2? I don't know. Let's just close in prayer, and you guys can pray about it, ask God about it. Let's land there. Now, here's what's real. It's that at some point, as followers of Jesus, we will all walk through seasons where God feels distant from us, where prayers go unanswered, and where we wonder, is God even listening at all? And does he even care? As sometimes it can feel like we're praying to a brick wall. And even in our imagination, we can assume that he's working against us somehow. Like, I don't know how all these bad things are happening. It's almost like God's doing this to me because what's going wrong could go wrong. I can't explain it. Feels like somehow God's doing this to me. Did I do something wrong? What did I do to deserve this? These are questions we will sometimes find ourselves asking. But here's what we see in Lamentations 2. It's that even in those places where maybe we're questioning God, or where God feels distant from us in our pain, or where maybe even we're angry at God. In those places, we have a choice. We have a choice. Listen, we can either turn inward and just shut down spiritually, emotionally, numbing ourselves with our distraction of our choice, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. We can look inward, turn inward, suppress our emotions, ignore those hard questions, pretend everything's okay when it's not. We can do that for a little while. We can turn inward, or we can look upward, pressing into prayer and bringing our honest and even angry questions to God in prayer, in community with other people, being honest with others about our questions and our feelings and our anger as well, because we can't do this alone. We can turn inward or we can look upward. That's the choice that Lamentations 2 puts before us. It's what we see in this passage. It's the poet models for us what it looks like to keep looking up and to keep praying even when it feels like nothing is happening, when it feels pointless and like God is distant and removed from him. He's not answering him. That's the invitation of Lamentations 2. We're going to look inward or are we going to look upward? And as followers of Jesus, we don't do this blindly, do we? Because when we look to Jesus, you know what we see? We see that Jesus, too, experienced unanswered prayer. Praying in the garden the night before he was crucified. Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Please, I don't want to have to go to the cross. That was his prayer. And yet he went to the cross. And then on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where'd you go? Where are you? As even Jesus knew what it was like for God to feel distant from him and for prayers to go unanswered, for God to feel silent. And yet we know now, don't we, that in the cross, God was not silent at all. Because in Jesus, God doesn't stand at a distance from our suffering, but he actually enters into it, taking on the full weight of our sin and all of its consequences, not by turning away from us and by condemning us, but by, in his self-giving love, bearing it for us on the cross and ultimately overcoming it in the resurrection. Taking then everything that we see here in Lamentations 2, God's anger, his judgment, and even his silence, and reframing it now through the cross, where now we can know that God is not actually against us, but he is for us, because the cross shows us so. Even when it doesn't feel that way. Even when we forget. Even when heaven feels quiet and somehow it even feels like God's working against us, the cross shows us that he's for us and not against us, that he is never absent. He is always at work, inviting us to come home to a God who loves us and who promises to never leave us nor forsake us, even when it feels like he has. And if you wouldn't call yourself a follower of Jesus here this morning, the invitation to come to him, to see the God revealed to us in Christ on the cross, to trust in him, to begin a relationship with him, it is open to you too. God doesn't have to feel far from you either, because he is near to us in the person of Jesus. But here's the invitation for all of us here today, coming out of this chapter, before we come to the Lord's table in just a moment. Here's the simple invitation. There's a lot of questions, a lot of emotion, a lot of things that can come out of a chapter like this, but here's the simple invitation. When God feels silent, when he feels absent, when he feels like he's working against us somehow, here it is. It's to never stop praying. To never stop praying. To keep coming to him when prayers feel unanswered. To keep coming to him when it feels like we're praying to a brick wall. To keep coming to him when God doesn't make sense to us and the events of our life don't make sense to us, is to keep coming to him. Because the moment we stop coming to him is the moment we begin to be deformed. And God is in the business of forming us, not deforming us. And prayer is the way, one of the main ways he does that. It's to not stop praying in the suffering. That's the invitation. Don't stop. Keep showing up. Keep bringing your hard questions, your doubts, your frustration, your anger to God in prayer. Because the cross shows us that God is big enough to handle all of it. All of it. Let me pray for us.